Down in the Louisiana Bayou. Louisiana Creole is a language bustling with culture and tradition that has shaped the lives of those who speak the language throughout the years. The influence the Louisiana Creole has on the culture and the community surrounding it can still be seen to this day. For instance, we see it in holidays celebrated such as Mardi Gras, a Catholic holiday with African and Caribbean influences, in traditional foods like jambalaya and gumbo, in the religion practice, Catholicism and voodoo, and even in jazz and zydeco music. Despite these prominent cultural impacts, Louisiana Creole has become a severely endangered language. If nothing is done to reverse that, the language will eventually go extinct. By enforcing efforts to preserve the language, one is investing in their future and safeguarding their identity that derives from their method of communication. For this reason, Louisiana Creole should receive aid in maintaining its status as a living language through programs that conserve and promote their values and traditions. Louisiana Creole is an indigenous language to southern Louisiana with French, Spanish, and Native American influences taking root in New Orleans that made an impact on local traditions, culture, religion, and various other aspects of the community. The term Creole was first used in the 16th century to identify descendants of Spanish, Portuguese, or French settlers who lived in the West Indies and Latin America. Throughout the years, the definition of Creole has changed several times, causing identification factors to vary. According to the American Heritage Dictionary, the term Creole is defined as the following. 1. A person of European ancestry born in the West Indies or Spanish America. 2. A person descended from or culturally related to the original French settlers of the southern United States, especially Louisiana. 3. A person descended from or culturally related to the Spanish and Portuguese settlers of Gulf states. 4. A person of mixed African and European ancestry who speaks a creolized language, especially one based on French or Spanish. 5. A black slave born in the Americas as opposed to one brought from Africa. Given these choices, many people were able to identify as Creole, resulting in a melting pot of various cultures. Even so, as stated by Louisiana historian Fred B. Niffen, the term Creole has been loosely extended to include people of mixed blood, a dialect of French, a breed of ponies, a distinctive way of cooking, a type of house, and many other things. It is therefore no precise term and should not be defined as such, thus making for the identification as Creole based on one's personal choice. Consequently, numbers of Louisiana Creole speakers range from as little as less than 7,000 speakers to as many as less than 50,000. Multiple reasons can attest to the language discrepancy that Louisiana Creole faces, particularly in the social aspect of language. Helen Bush Caver and Mary T. Williams points out that many young Creoles of color today live under pressure to identify themselves as African Americans. Several young white Creoles want to avoid being considered of mixed race. Therefore, both young black and white Creoles often choose an identity other than Creole. In this case, resulting in a lack of pride and desire to associate with Creole, reducing personal efforts to practice the language. There has also been a history of discrimination against Creole speakers, causing many to unwillingly identify themselves as speakers of Creole. In order to keep Louisiana Creole from going extinct, one must want to associate themselves with the history and culture that derives from that language and actively practice the language in everyday interactions. In this case, we see many Creole speakers who deny that label by identifying as something else, causing the language to lose valuable speakers. Instead, we see speakers of Creole identify themselves simply as French speakers. The negative social and cultural connotations of Creole identity made it unappealing for others to claim as their native language. As a result, the negative implications associated with Creole create inaccurate data in the number of Creole speakers there are. The following figure gives a visual representation of how endangered the language is, illustrating where Louisiana Creole falls within the cloud of all the living languages. Represented by the large yellow dot on the graph, according to the EGID level it falls on, Louisiana Creole is considered in trouble. According to the Ethnologue, level 7 EGID is defined as follows. Intergenerational transmission is in the process of being broken, but the childbearing generation can still use the language, so it is possible that revitalization efforts could restore transmission of the language in the home. In other words, the language is actively practiced within the older community, but will not survive unless it is passed down from the older generation to the younger generation. Most of the language's speakers are much older, and rarely do the children grow up learning Creole, creating a language gap within the community. Rather than teaching the upcoming generation to speak Creole, they are taught to speak English. Seeing that the language is most actively used within the older crowd, it creates a bigger urgency to find methods that preserve and help keep the language alive before time runs out. Another point that contributed to the endangerment of Louisiana Creole is its historicity and indeterminacy, as mentioned by Dr. David Frank at a symposium on endangered Creole languages. While other languages derive from older forms of speech, Creole has a definite starting point, which creates a more difficult time in pinpointing the creation and the use of language. Sometimes Creole is not even considered a language, but rather a dialect, undermining its true value and downplaying its significance as a true form of expression. Because of misconceptions about the language, it is often misunderstood, putting Creole in risk of further endangerment. Although things might look a bit grim for the future of Louisiana Creole, there are efforts already in effect that are contributing to its preservation and sustainment as a living language. As suggested by Dr. Frank, documenting the language is part of the answer. By keeping physical record of the language, it stands a better chance at surviving as opposed to oral languages that are more difficult to learn and pass down due to its exclusivity. Keeping a detailed account of grammar and syntax rules benefits in the preservation of the language. To keep a language alive, it must be easy to teach and learn. Through scribing and proper documentation, Louisiana Creole can benefit from preservation efforts that have been proven effective based on other languages that have been successfully revived through similar means. Christophe Landry, a linguistic historian with a PhD in American history at the University of Sussex, has made tremendous efforts in saving the language by several months editing the Dictionary of Louisiana Creole. His hard work has helped to produce the first ever online dictionary of Louisiana Creole in an effort to keep the language from growing extinct. This resource allows users to enter words in English and see its translation in Louisiana Creole and vice versa. The dictionary also provides examples of how it would be used in context, making it much easier to understand the language in hopes of its revival. With this type of resource, users are able to learn about the proper grammar usage of Louisiana Creole through an easy-to-access method, resulting in well-informed language learners who can spread their knowledge to others as well. By creating a formal writing system for the language, revival efforts are much more successful as compared to keeping the language as an oral tradition. Another method of successfully preserving Louisiana Creole is through the use of technology. The conservation of a language requires more than just writing it down. It must be used frequently within our everyday lives to maintain its status as a living language. Jonathan Amos recognizes that languages are using social media, YouTube, text messaging, and various technologies to expand their voice and expand their presence. As helpful as it is to create a written source to preserve language, efforts that must also take into effect is the everyday use and practice of the language. As we live in a society where our lives are immersed in technology, there's no better way to revitalize a dying language than by promoting its usage through the use of the same technology we surround ourselves with. As stated by linguist David Harrison, one of the benefits of the internet is that endangered languages can reach a global audience. There is greatness in numbers, and technology is a powerful and widespread tool that would greatly advance the existence of Louisiana Creole as a dominant form of speech in a language atmosphere. Boise Peter acknowledges this fact and uses it to her advantage as she discusses with an Apple engineer about future plans to implement Louisiana Creole into the next version of iOS. By doing so, Peter is empowering the younger generation to use Creole in their everyday lives through texting and email. It also opens up the opportunity of translation services for app developers who also want to support the modernization of the language. By making it easier to access their more popular forms of communication, a digital footprint for the language is created, making for a more permanent form of language documentation. The opportunity to select Louisiana Creole from the language list on iOS creates a higher standard for the language. First-class language citizens, as Peter would describe. As a language that is notably enough to exist in the iOS universe, it elevates its prominence as a language, ultimately creating a universal support system to keep Louisiana Creole alive and prospering. In addition to the technological resolutions that are being put into effect, preservation efforts have spread within communities as well. The Creole Heritage Center created the Creole Language Documentation Project in response to concerns from the Creole community. A crucial aspect of the project is to provide training in language documentation, creating qualified community researchers. Community researchers can be just about anyone who is willing to commit to the project, ranging from fluent Creole speakers to those who are just beginning to learn the language. The purpose of the project is to train people how to document, preserve, and revitalize Louisiana Creole. This training program will create a linguistic network for the documentation of the language to be passed down to future generations. Likewise, cultural conservation efforts are also being put into effect to revitalize the language. Connor William emphasizes how losing a language means losing knowledge of the world that is at once subtle and comprehensive, unique and intuitive. In other words, losing a language represents losing an exclusive way of viewing the world. Every language has its own unique interpretation of the world. If we lose a language, we undeniably lose that knowledge. Mass language extinction is highly detrimental to the shared knowledge within communities. One would be losing the way a group of people interpret and view the world, creating a gap in our understanding of life. In hopes that the point of view that Creole provides does not disappear, the Louisiana Folklife Program was designed to identify and preserve Louisiana's culture through recordings of traditional music and folklore, interviews, and other methods of documentation and preservation. Conserving folklife enriches the culture and boosts pride in the many heritage that come from the language. To do so, it means encouraging and helping communities to carry on the best of their traditions and support their way of life. Sylvie Dubois and Megan Melancon consider language to be an important cultural identification marker that defines a person's cultural existence. Notably, the Louisiana Folklife Festival provides a public celebration of that culture and tradition, popularizing the language as well. The festival presents a variety of traditions that are practiced in the Creole community and offers acceptance and celebration of the multiple cultures seen throughout the region. For this reason, the culture and traditions of Louisiana Creole are preserved in order to maintain the prosperity of the language. Even though there are overwhelming efforts being put into effect to revitalize Louisiana Creole, some critics believe that some of those efforts are just a waste of time. Keenan Malik argues that it's irrational to try and save all endangered languages and states that it is ridiculous to save every cultural form there is. Although it may be true that not every single language and culture that exists can be saved, a loss of linguistic diversity negatively impacts our knowledge of language and culture around the world. There is knowledge and wisdom that derives from each language. As John McWhorter puts it, if the language dies, a fascinating way of thinking dies along with it. Language provides unique expressions of a person's culture, values, thoughts, and worldviews, so loss of language would have a negative impact on communities, causing social and cultural disruptions. Language itself is often the only way to convey a community's songs, stories, and poems. To speak a shared language with other people is a powerful tool for a sense of community and connection. By documenting and preserving how a person's identity and culture is closely tied to their language, one is safeguarding unique expressions of worldview that present how language is central to being human. Given these points, by investing in conservation techniques and revitalizing Louisiana Creole as a living language, one is sustaining a unique way of interpreting the world and providing a sense of shared values around the region. The influence that Louisiana Creole has on its speakers represents who they identify as and how they interact with one another, allowing for open expression of their culture, values, and thoughts. Conservation and preservation efforts will reverse language extinction, making an investment in their futures. With all things considered, Louisiana Creoles offers us diverse perspective on life that deserves a fighting chance at survival for future generations to come.